From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Congress set to return from recess tomorrow with control of the U.S. House still up in the air at this hour. We're joined by Erin Covey of the Cook Political Report with the latest from the campaign to Capitol Hill, including a leadership battle in the Senate. Donald Trump leans into the transition, tapping Congresswoman Elise Stefanik as UN ambassador, Tom Homan as border czar, and Lee Zeldin to lead the EPA. We'll talk about these choices and the cabinet yet to be filled with our political panel. And as the Kremlin denies reports of a Trump meeting with Vladimir Putin, we'll talk about the geopolitical impact of Trump 2.0 with Richard Haas from the Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks for joining us on the Monday edition here of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We are back in the Capitol, where we start tonight with a look at Capitol Hill. Congress set to return from recess this week with quite a few items on the agenda as they enter the lame duck session. Joining us now with more is Bloomberg's Megan Scully. Of course, Megan, we have to acknowledge that we're not sure who is going to control the House in the next Congress. Why don't we start there with 19 races yet to be called? It does look like the math favors Republicans tonight.
It certainly does. We're at about 214 seats, I believe, for Republicans, but they're pretty much guaranteed at least two more. So we're really kind of getting down to the wire here. It's particularly these races in California, and there are a few others sprinkled around the country, but it certainly looks favorable.
The numbers in California are incredible. In 2024, still almost 5 million votes to count. Almost 1 million in Los Angeles County. What takes so long?
So they're just notoriously slow at counting these votes, and voters have a whole week to get their, as long as it's postmarked by Election Day, they can count votes that come in up to a week after Election Day. So that's what's really causing this holdup here. And then voters can also, if their provisional ballots get rejected, they can appeal that as well.
So all of that is happening as we speak. It could be days or weeks then until we actually know who controls the House, it sounds like.
I think we're getting close. I would think by the middle of this week we should know. We might not know every single race for a few more days, but we're certainly getting to the point.
So it's entirely likely that Republicans will end up with the same size majority, the same thin majority that they have now. With that said, to what extent does this election then color the lame duck session? We've got a funding battle looming here. We're going to run out of money just before Christmas. A couple of other big items that need to be tacked. Emergency funding following the hurricanes. God forbid they tackle the farm bill. How much can get done here between now and the end of the year?
So what I suspect will happen is that, and certainly our reporting indicates that they're going to kick spending into the spring. So they're just going to delay that deadline a little bit longer, and Trump will tackle that. There are, I think the Senate is going to be focused almost exclusively on confirming the last batches of Biden's judicial nominees, because that's something that Senate Democrats can get through expeditiously before the end of the year. So that will be a key priority and something that will add to Biden's legacy, and Democrats would say serve as a check on the incoming administration.
I want to ask you about a vote that's going to happen Wednesday in the Senate for leader. This is to replace Mitch McConnell, who's been there for a long time. This is a pretty big deal. It's devolved into a whole new competition since the MAGA world decided that Rick Scott was its choice. Donald Trump hasn't made an endorsement, but it's something that I talked about earlier today with Ron Bonjean, a co-founder partner at Rock Solutions, a Republican strategist who shared whether he believes Trump will actually endorse in this case. Here he is.
If Trump knew who the winner was going to be out of this, he would probably back that person, because you don't, going in being the most, president-elect, you're not going to want to back a loser. That's a bad message you're sending in right away, that you made a strategic mistake. So he's being very careful.
Remembering Rick Scott, the MAGA preferred candidate, senators up against John Thune and John Cornyn, I guess seen as more establishment figures. We were led to believe that John Thune was in the lead, but this is a secret ballot. To what extent can Donald Trump impact the outcome?
So certainly if he were to weigh in, it would make a difference with many senators. He's been asked not to by Thune and some others. Yep. Of course, he had Elon Musk weigh in, which is essentially, by extension, almost a Trump endorsement. And he endorsed Rick Scott, he's certainly the most MAGA of the candidates. But as you said, it is a secret ballot. Rick Scott isn't particularly well-liked within the caucus. He did challenge Mitch McConnell 2 years ago, and I think he had about something in the order of 11 or 12 votes, and that was it. Thune and Cornyn are much more popular with sort of the broader array of senators. It will be interesting, though. This will be sort of the first test of Musk's power over the Senate, and whether they'll listen to, a pretty extraordinary move by the world's richest man to involve himself in what is really a very internal discussion.
Yeah, this is pretty esoteric stuff. Yeah. Elon Musk trying to thumb the scale. Tucker Carlson now with an endorsement. Who knew? This is the world we're in. Bloomberg's Megan Scully, thank you so much as the ground continues to move beneath our feet here on Capitol Hill. Today, President-elect Trump made it a bit more complicated, announcing his plans to name New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik to serve as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, putting her at the center of U.S. relations with Russia, Ukraine, North Korea, and Iran. Here's UN Secretary General spokesperson responding to the news.
Leaders of member states will appoint their representatives, and we will work constructively with the permanent representative of the United States, just like we do with every other country.
Joining us now for a look at the global impact of this decision, Bloomberg's national security reporter, Dan Flatley. Dan, it's great to have you with us. Donald Trump making clear in his statement announcing this that she was the first member of Congress to endorse him. And we know there's a pretty real loyalty test here to building out the cabinet and working for Donald Trump. What will the gentlewoman from New York mean for the United Nations?
Well, Joe, I think it'll be very interesting to see how this all plays out. Certainly, Stefanik is a New Yorker. She represents a district in upstate New York. So it makes some sense for her to be going home in a way to represent the U.S. at the United Nations there in Manhattan. She has really made her brand, at least recently, as being one of Donald Trump's staunchest supporters, and also a staunch supporter of Israel. And she has really hammered home that message with the hearings that she's held, sort of holding college administrators' feet to the fire on anti-Semitism on campus and other things of that nature. So I think that you could see certainly her pushing that line at the United Nations. And also, if you recall, in the first Trump administration, Nikki Haley, although she wasn't in Washington, D.C., was a very prominent voice for Trump's brand, for his policies at the United Nations. And it's a very high-profile position because, excuse me, of the media market and everything else in New York, and also all the world leaders coming in and out. So I think certainly it signals that whatever Trump decides to do on important issues like Russia and Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, the Middle East, other things of that nature, he's going to have a very loyal, very vocal champion in Stefanik there at the United Nations.
Ironic timing to hear or see Donald Trump post on Truth Social over the weekend that Nikki Haley would not be hired as part of this incoming administration. Big questions about Ukraine as we consider her impact on the UN discussion. There's been reporting that Donald Trump met with Vladimir Putin or by phone since the election. There's also reporting that he is setting up a meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. Do you get the sense, as he tells supposedly Vladimir Putin to not escalate the war in Ukraine, that we could have some kind of a breakthrough to coincide with the inauguration?
It's possible. That's what he has advertised as being his position. He has said, I will resolve this on day one or even before day one.
He's got a couple of months to resolve it now.
He's got some time. It's a very difficult situation to resolve without giving Putin what he wants, which is to keep the territory that he has already seized, his troops have already seized in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians do not view that as a viable option, and they have said that they're going to continue to fight on in any case. Now, the problem is, of course, that without the backing of the U.S. and Ukraine's European allies, it's going to be very difficult to continue that fight. So the U.S. is obviously a key part of this whole equation. Whether Europe can step up in the absence of continued U.S. support or not, all needs to sort of play out here. But I think if I'm Volodymyr Zelensky sitting in Kyiv, I'm a little nervous about how all this is going to play out at the moment.
This is going to be quite the interesting meeting when it does happen. Bloomberg's Dan Flatley, thank you so much. Dan, of course, reporting from our national security team. And we do want to say Happy Veterans Day to Dan and all of the veterans watching and listening. While we're at it, Dan, of course, not just a veteran, but a Marine. Happy birthday. 249 years for the Marine Corps. We actually cut a cake today in the Bureau. Dan, we salute you and thank you for your service. Coming up, we'll continue to look at the global impact of the impending second Trump administration with an important voice. Richard Haass, the President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, will be with us next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
President Biden will have the opportunity over the next 70 days to make the case to the Congress and to the incoming administration that the United States should not walk away from Ukraine, that walking away from Ukraine means more instability in Europe. And ultimately, as the Japanese Prime Minister said, if we walk away from Ukraine in Europe, the question about America's commitment to our allies in Asia will grow.
White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on Sunday morning TV talking on CBS there on the current administration's commitment to Ukraine through the remainder of President Biden's term. There are, of course, great questions about what happens after that. And with us now, Richard Haass, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Senior Counsel at Centerview Partners, author of The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens. Mr. Haass, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's good to see you. I'd like to start with what you're hearing and whether there's a level of fear when it comes to Ukraine specifically among those in European capitals ahead of Donald Trump coming back to the White House.
Well, the short answer is there is some concern or fear, as you put it. In part, it's because of things said during the campaign, either by the president-elect or the vice president-elect. I don't think things were eased, shall we say, by the announcement that Mike Pompeo would not be part of the cabinet. Normally, a president-elect announces his cabinet choices. This is the first time I can remember a president-elect announcing someone who wouldn't be a choice. And given that Pompeo was quite hawkish on Ukraine, again, it reinforced the message that something is afoot, not necessarily reassuring to Ukraine.
Interesting. Tell me more about what you think is happening right now. Donald Trump reportedly meeting already by phone since the election with Vladimir Putin. He suggested to us, without saying it, that meeting with Vladimir Putin, I think the way he put it was, would be a good thing since he left the White House. So presumably they've been in touch for some time. He's also in the preliminary stages of setting up a meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. As we sit here on the 11th of November, do you think that Donald Trump is trying to line up a deal to coincide with him taking office? What can he get done between now and January 20th?
I don't think he can get much done between now and January 20th. The real question is, what's the substance of the deal? The idea that he might push for peace or for a deal is in and of itself fine, but the devil's in the details, or if you prefer, the angels in the details. What would he expect of Ukraine? What would he be willing to offer to reassure it in the way of security? What message would he send to Russia and so forth? So again, I'm all in favor in principle of peace. This war is going on, this phase of it, for 3 years now. It's been horribly destructive. But what's the nature of the peace? And will it be a real peace? And what is being asked of each side? So we'll just have to wait on that.
Right. Well, do you suspect that U.S. support, military support for Ukraine will end in January?
Well, if it does, you won't get an end to the war. If Ukraine has to fight on through a guerrilla war, it will do so. I think the only way you get Ukraine to end the war, if it's on reasonable terms, that would mean it keeps the 80% of its territory it controls. It's independent. It's allowed to forge connections to the EU, potentially to the United States or NATO. And Russia has to understand that if it doesn't agree to some type of an interim ceasefire or armistice, kind of along the lines we have on the Korean Peninsula, then the United States will continue to help Ukraine. And by the way, Ukraine will be free to use these arms against Russia. So again, a lot depends upon what Mr. Trump is prepared to do. You can get peace if you're prepared to get peace or something like it at any cost. But if the administration wants to avoid doing something that raises fundamental moral and strategic problems, it's got to be in support of something that's fair and reasonable.
Donald Trump has tapped Elise Stefanik to be our ambassador to the United Nations. What will this lawmaker from upstate New York bring to geopolitics, assuming that she gets this job and accepts the job that he's offered?
What I think more than anything is it sends a signal of support for Bibi Netanyahu in Israel. Representative Stefanik is known more than anything for her performance during the hearings with some of these Ivy League presidents, her correctly pointing out some of their double standards and the like. But I think what she brings to this job is not vast foreign policy experience, but clear support for Israel. And my guess is, based upon Mr. Trump's first 4 years as president, that's the message he wants. Lots of votes come up in the UN, and that's one of the places the United States can signal its support for Israel.
Okay, so Elise Stefanik heads to the UN, and Benjamin Netanyahu visualizes what world? What will this mean 6 months down the road for apparently his preferred candidate here, Donald Trump, to take the White House?
Well, what he's hoping is that it means, like the first time around, he has a relatively free hand. He has a relatively, what you might describe as unconditional support from the United States. So he's pretty much free to continue the war in Gaza or up north against Hezbollah in Lebanon. He's free to continue with certain types of settlement activity, and he'll have American backing if there's a confrontation with Iran. So I think that's probably what Mr. Netanyahu is hoping.
Will he be able to succeed in either endeavor, or will we be talking about an endless war with Hamas, an endless war with Hezbollah?
Well, again, it takes only one to start a war. Hamas started this one. It takes two to stop it. Up to now, neither Israel nor Hamas has been prepared to stop it. As a result, the remaining hostages haven't come home. And as a result, people in Gaza continue to get killed. So it's really up to both sides. They both have to agree to stop it. Same between Israel and Hezbollah. I think there's a deal in the north to be had where Israel, would stop the attacks. Hezbollah would pull north. The Israelis who have been forced to leave their homes would be able to return home. But that's up to, a sense, Israel and Hezbollah being willing to accept that kind of a limited ceasefire. So on both sides, in both of these venues, you've got the outlines of a ceasefire. The question is whether both sides are prepared to sign on.
I haven't mentioned China in our conversation, Richard Haass. My remaining question is squarely on China. What will be the first act that Donald Trump takes when it comes to geopolitics in the White House, when he starts pulling out the Sharpie for executive orders on day one? Will it be tariffs against China?
If what he said is to be taken literally, yes, that you're looking at across-the-board tariffs on China, potentially far higher than the other tariffs that Mr. Trump has threatened to implement. Then the question is, how does China respond? What does Mr. Trump put forward as a condition for those tariffs being eased? So I think, but that's what we're most likely to see coming out of the box. Much more economic confrontation than geopolitical or military confrontation, at least on our side.
It's great to have you back once we know. Richard Haass is senior counsel at Centerview Partners, president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. Great to have you back, sir. Thank you. Coming up, the Trump trade throws gas on the Bitcoin boom. The digital asset hitting a record high, and we'll have a look at how crypto is reacting to another Trump administration with Bloomberg Business Week's Tim Stenovec, the host of The Crypto Show. He's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The goal is still to pass legislation, is still to get a regulatory regime in place. And we're excited now that more than half of Congress is coming in pro-crypto. And not just pro-crypto, or they're actually not just neutral. They're pro-crypto. They're engaged. They're more than open. We're seeing that in the Senate with 9 senators coming in, new senators who are going to be engaged. And then obviously President Trump with his very clear vision, I think, for the future of crypto in the United States.
Kara Calvert, Vice President for U.S. Policy for Coinbase, on Bloomberg's The Close a bit earlier today. This followed Bitcoin's price surging past $88,000 to a new record high following Donald Trump's win and the prospect of a Congress with pro-crypto lawmakers, a lot more of them. Price is lower now, but still a massive surge over the past week. And joining us for a closer look at why is Bloomberg Crypto's co-host Tim Stenovec with us from New York. Tim, thank you so much for joining. What timing for you to be at the helm of this program. I guess it's to the moon here. People are talking 100,000 for the next stop on Bitcoin, but we've seen crypto rising across the board. Tim, is it justified?
Justified is always a good question. I mean, you know, the naysayers would say, hey, this is something that has no cash flows. It has no use beyond what people say is, a use of storing value. It's made up on the blockchain. But the folks out there who are pro-crypto say, look, this is the perfect thing we need in an environment where deficits are rising, where we've been scared by inflation in recent years. And I think the big picture here, and a big part of this, of course, has to do with the re-election or the election of Donald Trump and the way his stance has really shifted when it comes to crypto.
You've got the political side of this that's driving things, Tim. How much of this is institutional, the money, the inflows that we're seeing in crypto, specifically Bitcoin, as opposed to, crypto bros or retail investors getting on board following Donald Trump?
That's a really good question. We're seeing a lot of inflows, record inflows when it comes into the ETFs. But the folks I talk to say this is just the beginning here. I mean, I spent all afternoon on Bloomberg Business Week talking to traditional money managers and asking them if crypto is part of their portfolios. And even if it is part of their portfolios, it's a tiny part of their portfolios at this point. I think this is much more about right now people betting that we're going to see crypto continue to rise because of policies that are put into place by this pro-crypto Congress that was just elected and by the Trump administration, which has really changed its tune. I mean, Donald Trump called this thing a scam years ago, but he's really changed his tune on crypto in recent months.
But it sounds like you're suggesting that there's institutional money on the sidelines that could give this a long way to go.
Yeah, look, I have no idea what the price is going to do, but no question, people would say to you that they're just scratching the surface when it comes to institutional interest. One thing I will say today, and we had Mike Regan on, he's over at the crypto desk, he's senior reporter, a senior editor over there. He mentioned the importance of Trump's, this idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, and that making people so bullish on crypto. So we'll see if that actually comes to fruition.
The idea of the government actually investing. Bloomberg Crypto's Tim Stenovec, thank you so much. I want to mention, catch Tim and Sonali Basak, 12 noon, New York time tomorrow on Bloomberg TV. Bloomberg Crypto with much more on what we're talking about now. Coming up, Congress returns this week. We'll have a look at the to-do list next on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for joining us. The foundation of the upcoming Trump administration is starting to take shape. The transition is underway, and Republicans are already strategizing over how to implement their agenda with what is likely to be control of the White House, the Senate, and the House. A key player in making that happen will be whomever fills the soon-to-be vacant position of Senate Majority Leader. One of those contenders now, Republican leader, is Senator Rick Scott of Florida, who made this pitch.
We have got to change the way the Senate is run to get Trump's agenda done. What it's going to take is somebody who's going to take the time to sit down and bring people together. We've got to get, for a lot of things, 60 votes in the Senate. So we've got to have somebody that's going to sit down with Democrats and say, how do we balance a budget? How do we do these things? Okay. That's all I've done. I'm a deal guy.
On Fox News yesterday. Joining us now, Erin Covey, editor at the Cook Political Report. Erin, welcome back. It's good to see you post-election. This whole thing got pretty wild over the weekend. We should be clear. Leadership races on Capitol Hill are pretty esoteric, typically don't get a lot of mainstream news coverage or, broad-based endorsements. That's changed in this case now. The MAGA community has become involved, deeply involved. The likes of Tucker Carlson, Charlie Kirk, even Elon Musk are now throwing their support behind Rick Scott as kind of an anti-establishment candidate instead of John Thune, instead of John Cornyn. But, Erin, I don't have to tell you, this is a secret ballot. Can MAGA have an impact here or not?
Right. Well, thank you for having me on, Joe. So this is going to be a little bit more difficult for the MAGA community than it might look on its face. And that's because the Senate is more immune to the kinds of pressure campaigns that have maybe influenced previous dramas in Congress. And that's because this election will take place with the secret ballot. And Republican senators like John Cornyn and John Thune have much deeper relationships with their Senate colleagues than someone like Senator Rick Scott, who doesn't have quite as many allies in that chamber. But whether or not Trump himself gets involved, I think, is the real question here. And there's a question of whether or not he has an incentive to get involved, because he's going to have to work with whoever wins this battle. And so it's an open question of whether or not he takes sides.
I guess we're going to find out Wednesday when this vote takes place. We've seen Senator Marco Rubio, Senator Bill Hagerty get on board with the Rick Scott train. But we keep hearing senators don't like to be bullied, that this is different than a leadership battle for Speaker, for instance, in the U.S. House. I guess that will be something that runs under the cover of a secret ballot. Erin, do you think John Thune is still in the lead?
You know, I think he probably is. And I think he and Cornyn have a lot more allies on their side than someone like Rick Scott, who was criticized by a lot of his Republican peers after his leadership of the National Republican Senatorial Committee last cycle, when they failed to pick up seats that they should have been able to win, and also for his push of a policy agenda plan that had little support within the chamber. But I do think that these two Republican senators are probably the two leaders at this point, and Thune probably has the edge.
The chapter post Mitch McConnell. In the House, meantime, Erin, we don't know who is in charge, at least not yet. There are 19 races that have yet to be called, which is incredible. Many of them in California, where over the weekend they were still about 5 million votes away from finishing the job. The math is stacked against Democrats. Republicans only need to win 5 to maintain their majority. Democrats need 15 to take the majority. How are you looking at this now, a week almost after the election?
Yeah, so it's become increasingly clear that Republicans have a really clear path to the majority, and Democrats' path has narrowed increasingly over the weekend. Republicans picked up key wins in Colorado and Arizona, and in the outstanding races, they are favored in the ones that they need to win the majority. However, it looks like Republicans will have a similarly sized narrow majority, similar to what they had this past session. Currently, they have a 4-seat majority, and it looks like, if I had to guess, they'll probably have anywhere from 3 to 5 seats as a cushion. And so it's not going to be much different than this past session at all.
How about that? Which means a pretty familiar charge, I guess. If your name is Hakeem Jeffrey, that gives him quite a bit of power as the Democratic leader in the House, because Johnson will need Jeffries to get anything done, right?
Well, potentially. I mean, Republicans would have a trifecta in this scenario. But of course, there are a couple of rabble-rousers in the Republican House who could be a thorn in the side of Johnson, assuming that Republicans elect him Speaker again, which is yet to be seen. But he has made his second bid official. And so the leadership fight on the House side is a little bit more straightforward than in the Senate, where there are several folks vying for the top spot. But, you know, this does mean that every vacancy will matter, and it'll be difficult for Republicans to get things done when they only have a cushion of a couple of votes in the House, potentially.
What's going on in California, Erin? Maybe you can explain this to us. It's 2024. We're a week almost after the election. Almost 950,000 votes to be counted in L.A. County alone. As I mentioned, nearly 5 million statewide. What the heck takes so long in every election in California?
Yeah, California always takes a while to count its votes, and that's just because a majority of those votes are cast by mail, and it just takes longer for counties to process them. Some are faster than others, but the state has historically taken a long time, and so this is no surprise at all. There are currently 5 seats in the Republican column that we had rated as toss-ups. They're all Republican held, all in California, and none of those have been called at this point. It looks like Republicans have a slight edge in all 5, but if I had to guess, Democrats could be on track to pick up at least 1 or 2 of them. The one that looks best for Democrats right now is California's 27th district, held by Mike Garcia.
Fascinating. We've also got, of course, a Senate race that is yet to be called. There's one left. Arizona was called as a state for Donald Trump, but we still don't know what happens with Ruben Gallego versus Kari Lake. Do you know when we might find out, Erin? How many votes are left to count at this point?
Well, not as many, because Maricopa County, which is, of course, the largest county in Arizona, has really sped up their vote counting process compared to previous election cycles. But I do think it's pretty safe to say that Ruben Gallego has a pretty clear shot at getting that victory there. Kari Lake, the Republican nominee, would have to make up quite a bit of ground. And if the remaining votes split the way that they previously have, then Gallego should have it in the bag.
By the way, as we were talking about the House, if Mike Johnson keeps the majority, will there be, even if he's in the minority, will there be another look at the motion to vacate? This idea that we saw Kevin McCarthy dispatched under the MTV, as they call it, requiring just one member to hold up the whole show here with a very small amount of support. Is that something that will be in the future speakers, the speaker's future, rather, or will be renegotiated in the new Congress?
Well, we'll see. And I mean, some of that depends on the size of Republicans' majority in the House and whether or not a couple of members who want that can use that as leverage for supporting Johnson for that spot. So too soon to tell at this point, but it's certainly something that could be under consideration in the new rules package.
Good to see you, Erin. Erin Covey, editor of the Cook Political Report, with us on Bloomberg. Many thanks for the insights. Coming up, we'll have a look at the transition to the Trump administration as Donald Trump's cabinet begins to come into focus. We're naming names next with our political panel on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Trump is very clearly making moves early. He is not sitting still, going forward. You know, a lot of other president-elects carefully plan and time out their announcements. That's not the way Trump does it. He rolls them out there. I mean, the transition really hasn't officially begun.
It's Ron Bonjean, co-founder, partner, Rock Solutions, who helped to advise the first Trump transition, talking with us on the early edition of Balance of Power about how Donald Trump's transition is unfolding. We added several more names today, and joining us now, our political panel, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, alongside Matt Gorman, executive vice president at Targeted Victory, Republican strategist. Great to see you both. Thanks for spending the Monday after the election with us. To think we still haven't called the House yet, but that's not what we're talking about at this moment. Your thoughts on the transition? Stefanik goes to the UN. Tom Homan, fascinating, border czar, even though he was one of the authors of Project 2025, and we were told that they would not be part of the new Trump administration. I guess it's on. It's all fair game.
A couple of things. These are also, more importantly, some of the loyalist kind of Trump supporters, right? They're, along with Elise, they're getting their plum positions. Yeah, you know. And so, really, this is what you'd see, whether it was Kamala Harris or Trump. Their loyalists are going to make sure they get their pick of jobs. They get announced first. I think what you're going to see in the coming days, I think any time now I would expect Secretary of State or Defense to finally be called. But those are people I think they wanted to get out of the way first, make sure they had good landing spots.
Sure. OK, so we checked the boxes there. Jeannie, what do you think of Lee Zeldin, Matt just mentioned, running the EPA? What area of expertise does he have to run the agency?
Well, he's got a loyalty to Donald Trump, as Matt just talked about, which is number one. So, you know, I think his pick, I don't think is quite unexpected. It is another New Yorker, the second in, 48 hours? Donald Trump is coming home, I guess. But, you know, I think what's also interesting is what he decided to do over the weekend, which is to say who he's not going to choose in Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo, and particularly Mike Pompeo, because I think it speaks to something you were talking about earlier in the hour, which is where his foreign policy is headed. I mean, we are hearing an awful lot from the quote-unquote MAGA portion of the campaign, or the more MAGA portion of the campaign. And I think the fact that he's turning his back on somebody like Mike Pompeo is another suggestion that this is really going to be a much more isolationist, nationalistic foreign policy for him.
You know, it's interesting. We heard from Morgan Ortagus on that front, spoke on Bloomberg surveillance a bit earlier this morning, former spokesperson for the State Department in the first Trump administration, and shared what role she expects Elon Musk to take. Listen.
It looks like it's going to be an outside advisor role. I seriously doubt that he wants to divest and do a financial disclosure and go before the Senate for confirmation. Maybe he does, but that probably doesn't seem like it's in the cards. But President Trump, clearly had a very big advocate, a very big ally in Elon, and he's somebody who's been involved around the world. From my understanding from public reporting, he does hold a security clearance. So if that is still accurate and true, he would be able to be read into certain conversations.
Which would make sense as the man who runs SpaceX and was reportedly on a phone call with Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. To what extent will he be involved in geopolitics?
I would expect, I think Morgan has a good point here. I would maybe see an outside advisory type role. I mean, look, these are two guys who are extremely smart, and I think that there's a kinship between them. You've seen that over the last couple of months, certainly with Spaces, and they've done other things. So yeah. I would expect him to have some sort of outside advisory role at the very least. And, he's someone who, Trump always respects people that he sees as successful and also very wealthy. And Elon obviously checks both those boxes.
Right. It's not just the names that we're hearing in truth posts and statements from the campaign. There's a big list of people that were personnel, isolated, identified in Project 2025, essentially vetted staff that could go right into an administration. And I talked earlier on Balance of Power with Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation and one of the authors of Project 2025, what he had to say here regarding the influence of the policy framework on this new administration.
It is very much designed, as all of our previous projects have been designed, which is to be of service. And if I had to predict, the next administration is going to be filled with excellent men and women, not just because of the work we did, but most importantly because of the great acumen of the president-elect and vice president-elect and the team that they're already assembling.
I mentioned Tom Homan to you earlier. What is the relationship between Heritage, those who wrote the project, and what will be the White House? Because Trump tried to disavow himself from this whole thing, and it looks like they have a lot in common, Matt.
Well, they do, but here's the thing. There are a constellation of outside groups that always try to get their issues front and center. Yep. So they are not alone. I would point to America First policies as really the one that I think always has been the most in concert with the Trump White House. You have Linda McMahon. You have other folks who have worked at that and really have a relationship with them. Heritage and Project 25 they were always trying to get at the table. This was one of their ways. It obviously blew up in their face during the campaign. I think they're starting now to have this effort to try and get a little back a seat at the table and do a little rehab tour.
Well, yeah, gosh, I don't know your thoughts on this, Jeannie, but Heritage remembers, of course, the mandate for leadership that they gave to Ronald Reagan back in 1980 that helped to put them on the map. Why was this so controversial compared to that?
Yeah, first of all, Joe, your interview with Kevin was excellent, and everybody should go back and listen to it in its entirety. It was really, really compelling. And, I think why this has been so different is, of course, because Democrats pointed people to it. But I have read it. I've written about it. The details are what are really important for people to understand. The top lines, when you read about the 4 pillars and foundations, they are things like protect liberty that we can all get behind and the vast majority of Americans agree with. But when you read down to the details and you see what they have in store for the first 180 days, that's where people become concerned. These are things like getting rid of dismantling the Education Department, dismantling the Department of Commerce, getting rid of the FBI, removing the right to choose and the right to reproductive health, issues involving transgender rights, the traditional split between the state and religion. They would like to diminish that, right? So you read down to what they have in store for each of these departments, and to me, the most chilling aspect is what they're thinking about for people who are in our bureaucracy, our civil servants who we depend on for so many things. They would like to renew Schedule F and replace those people with loyalists, and they have a plan in place to do that. So that's why I think it's been so controversial, because the details of what they have in store, even if they fulfill a portion of what they've written about and suggested and have been promoting, would really change the core of who we are, and people need to think about what they want going forward in the United States.
Just quickly, should our viewers and listeners expect the FBI, the Department of Education, to be eliminated?
That's the thing. There's no they, right? Project 2025, Kevin Roberts wasn't elected. It was Donald Trump.
No.
Yeah, no. Look, I can understand. We played this game a lot during the campaign.
Yeah, sure.
There is no, seat at the table in the Trump cabinet for the Heritage Foundation. I think that's a very common mistake. It's certainly not usurping where Donald Trump is.
Well, it's good that we're talking about it. Coming up with our panel, Congress returning this week. They're back tomorrow. What's on the docket for the lame duck? We'll do that next with Matt and Jeannie on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The Senate is more immune to the kinds of pressure campaigns that have maybe influenced previous dramas in Congress, and that's because this election will take place with the secret ballot. And Republican senators like John Cornyn and John Thune have much deeper relationships with their Senate colleagues than someone like Senator Rick Scott, who doesn't have quite as many allies in that chamber. But whether or not Trump himself gets involved, I think, is the real question here. And there's a question of whether or not he has an incentive to get involved, because he's going to have to work with whoever wins this battle.
Erin Covey of the Cook Political Report talking with us just moments ago on Balance of Power about the leadership battle in the U.S. Senate. Who will be the next Mitch McConnell? With us now, Jeannie Shanzano and Matt Gorman, our great panel. Matt, as the Republican, I'm sure you're watching this very closely. To see MAGA get involved in this is interesting. Rick Scott gets a boost, not directly from President Trump, but those in his orbit. We've got two establishment candidates, John Thune, John Cornyn. Who's in the lead here?
I was talking with somebody who's been on the Hill forever, and I go, how unprecedented is this for a race like this? He goes, Matt, the fact that you have a competitive majority leader race is at all
getting mainstream news coverage.
Yes, let alone you have people jockeying. So that is a huge part. Certainly, if you're a Rick Scott supporter, or if you're Rick Scott, you want your supporters to be public. You want people to know that you actually have a base of support, whatever that may be. Now, what I'm hearing, though, is obviously Thune has kind of that establishment support. He was thought to have the leg up. Cornyn's also making a run here. Don't discount Cornyn. Okay. Scott is still someone who has a smaller band of support. But again, secret ballot, anything can happen.
And a secret ballot suggests that Donald Trump may not have that much influence. Jeannie, I don't know if you expect an outright endorsement here by Donald Trump himself, but does Chuck Schumer care who wins?
Oh, sure he cares. First of all, I think Donald Trump has already entered into the fray. That was the whole point of this. We may not need to go through confirmation. Let's just recess appoint all these people. And then you had the three of them, Scott, Thune, and Cornyn, jump on the wagon. Great idea. We'll do that. So I think he's, putting it out there that he is testing to see who is the most loyal, because that's what he is most interested in. And not for nothing, but you also had Rubio and Haggerty, who both want cabinet positions, endorsing Scott. So I think he's already in this thing. And sure, Schumer does care an awful lot. That's why he made the decision that senators-elect may not participate, which keeps Dave McCormick and Ruben Gallego, should he, assume get the votes out of the room. So he himself is putting his thumb on the needle there.
The Senate vote is Wednesday. Presumably we'll know pretty quickly when that secret ballot is counted. We're assuming that Mike Johnson will be the leader in the House, because the math right now makes it a lot easier for Republicans to win the chamber. Is that your expectation? When the heck do we find out?
When does California finally count their darn votes? Maybe by Christmas we'll have an idea. But no, Mike Johnson will be the Speaker of the House if Republicans take it back, because they certainly will. Look, I think underrated story of last year. People really underestimated Mike Johnson and his ability to hang on to this job, ability to execute it well. And look, he'll get a little support, maybe not a huge amount of bump, but he has a hold of that conference, at least for the foreseeable future right now.
Does that mean the same playbook for Hakeem Jeffries going forward, Jeannie? He's been practicing this for a minute.
Yeah, the same playbook, except he no longer has the Democrats in the White House. So it's a little bit different for him. But yeah, he knows what he is doing. He works well with Speaker Johnson. And so I think the loyal opposition is the place he is certainly going to find himself in. And he is going to be raising a lot of money for 2026. That is their focus now.
Jeannie Shanzano and Matt Gorman, great conversation. Thank you both so much. Our political panel on the Monday edition of Balance of Power. We've got a lot more to learn this week in terms of elections, the House being called. We've got one more Senate race out there, Arizona, and of course the names in the transition for Trump 2.0. To that end, read a lot more in the Washington edition newsletter, on the terminal, and online. And thanks for joining us today on Balance of Power. We'll see you back here tomorrow with Kayleigh Lyons in the chair. This is Bloomberg.